Unit 8. Culinary Tools. 8.2. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 7.
In Europe, knives have been used as weapons, tools and eating utensils since prehistoric times, and spoons are equally ancient. In the early Stone Age, tens of thousands of years ago, it seems that in southern Europe, spoons were made of shells. Evidence for this includes the fact that later the Greek and Latin words for a spoon come from the word for the shell of a snail. In northern Europe, wood was probably the most common material, and again there's linguistic evidence for this. Though forks are much more recent, they trace their origins back over 2,000 years to the ancient Greeks. Their forks had two tines, they're the points that go into the food, and were designed to hold meat steady while it was carved and served. The tines allowed it to slide off easily. By the 7th century, royal courts of the Middle East had begun to use forks at the table for dining. Forks became fairly common among the wealthy in Byzantium, modern Istanbul, and in the 11th century they were introduced into Italy. The Italians, however, were slow to start using them. During the Middle Ages, very roughly from the 9th or 10th century up to and including the 15th, Europeans used knives and their fingers for eating. Hosts didn't provide knives for their guests, and most people carried their own in sheaths attached to their belts. These knives had pointed ends and were used to spear food and raise it to the mouth. Spoons of the Middle Ages were generally made of wood or horn, although royalty often had spoons made of gold and other wealthy families might have silver ones. From about the 14th century, spoons made of brass, pewter and other metals became common. The use of pewter especially made spoons more affordable for ordinary people.
Questions 8 to 14.
By the 16th century, forks were in everyday use in Italy, and in 1533 they were brought from Italy to France when an Italian noblewoman married the future king of France. At first, using them was thought to be pretentious, and they were slow to catch on. In the early 17th century, an Englishman named Thomas Coriate brought the first forks back to England after seeing them in Italy during his travels. The English, however, thought forks unnecessary, treated them with ridicule and continued to use their hands. But slowly forks became fashionable among the wealthy. Small, slender-handled forks with two tines were used for sweet, sticky foods or for food which was likely to stain the fingers. By the middle of the 17th century, forks used solely for dining were luxuries made of expensive materials. They indicated social status and sophistication and were intended to impress guests. Early table forks, like kitchen forks, had two fairly long, widely spaced tines, which ensured that meat wouldn't twist while it was being cut, but small pieces of food fell between the tines. In late 17th century France, larger forks with four tines were developed. Diners were now less likely to drop food, and as the tines were curved, forks served as a scoop, so people didn't have to constantly switch to a spoon while eating. The fact that knives were still used as weapons always posed the threat of danger at the dinner table. However, once forks began to gain popular acceptance, forks being more efficient for spearing food, there was no longer any need for a sharp tip at the end of a dinner knife. In 1669, the King of France declared knives like this illegal on the street or at the dinner table, and he had all knife tips ground down in order to reduce violence. Other design changes followed. Cutlers, who manufactured knives, began to make the blunt ends wider and rounder so that small pieces of food could be piled on the knife and carried to the mouth. The birth of blunt-tipped knives in Europe had a lasting effect on American dining etiquette. At the beginning of the 18th century, very few forks were being imported to America. However, knives were being brought in and their tips became progressively blunter. Because Americans had very few forks and no longer had sharp-tipped knives, they had to use spoons in place of forks. They would use the spoon to steady food as they cut, and then switch the spoon to the opposite hand in order to scoop up food to eat. This style of eating has continued to the present day, though with the fork replacing the spoon. Many Americans cut their food, then lay the knife down and hold only the fork while they eat. During the last 100 years or so, the ornamental styles of cutlery popular in previous centuries have given way to much plainer designs, and stainless steel has replaced many of the materials used earlier. Now there's a whole range of cutlery intended for different purposes in the kitchen or dining room, including different spoons for soup, dessert, tea, coffee, knives for main course, steak, grapefruit, forks for cake, main course, dessert, and the list grows longer as new specialised implements are invented.
Progress Test 2. This test is in the teacher's book. You will hear part of a radio programme. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 5.
Next on Radio East, your favourite local radio station, we have Emma Thornton with Music News, her weekly update on music events in the region. Emma.
Thanks, Kevin. As usual, I'll start with next week's events. On Monday, remember, we've got the chance to hear amateur rock groups from all over the region competing in Radio East's annual rock contest. Well, demand for tickets is at record levels, so the competition has been moved from the town hall to the recreation centre, as the hall there is larger, so that means you can still buy tickets. Important news for jazz fans now. If you were planning to go to Wednesday evening's jazz concert at Clarkson School, I'm sorry to say that this won't now be taking place. This is because of structural problems that have just been discovered at the school hall, and it hasn't been possible to find an alternative venue at such short notice. Ticket holders should contact the school for further information. On Friday evening, there's a concert at the Town Hall given by the Eastern Counties Symphony Orchestra to celebrate its 25th anniversary. And if you haven't already got tickets, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed, as there are absolutely none left. It's a shame it isn't being held at the Recreation Centre where there are more seats. Now, last month, a capacity audience enjoyed the 70s night at the Town Hall, with several of the top bands of the 1970s taking part. This gig proved so popular that it's going to be repeated this Saturday at the same venue, so this is a last-minute addition to the week's events. I understand a private function at the Town Hall was cancelled, making it available for the 70s night. Sunday sees an afternoon of folk music from around the world. There's no charge for this event, which is taking place in Riverside Park from 11 until 5. You're advised to arrive early because a lot of people are expected. So that's the music events next week.
Before you hear the next part of the programme, you have some time to look at questions 6 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
Now I'll go on to events the week after next, starting with Tuesday the 18th, when there's an evening of music from West Africa. This will be held at the Recreation Centre, and all tickets cost £8. The usual reduced prices for groups aren't available for this event, I'm afraid, but there are concessions for students. Don't forget, you need to provide proof when you book. The following evening, the 19th, the Stars Touring Opera Company will be performing Bizet's ever-popular Carmen at the Town Hall. If you saw the company when they visited us last year, you'll know they're one of the best opera companies around, and the tickets are a bargain at £5 to £25. There are only a few left though, and the box office manager has asked me to remind you that the box office doesn't take email bookings, and because of staff shortages, they're giving priority to customers who come in person. If you use the phone, they may not be able to answer. And just one more event to mention. On the 21st, there'll be a varied programme of classical and popular songs performed by the Jamestown Singers, a group of talented young professionals from this area. The recital will take place at the university, and this is the first public performance there this autumn. Tickets cost £7 and must be booked in advance. Some of these young singers are likely to be the stars of the future, so it's well worth hearing them now. OK, and that ends this week's music news.
Thank you, Emma.
Unit 9, Old and New. 9.1, Exercises 2 and 3.
Okay, I'm going to talk to you about Venezia, that is to say Venice, which my mother comes from originally. Her parents still live there, but my mom moved away when she met my dad. He's from Puglia, in the south of Italy. We all live in Bari, the main city there. Okay, sorry, now I'm going to describe Venice. What can I say about Venice? It's an old city, and its infrastructure hasn't changed very much in hundreds of years. It's built on water, so instead of roads through the center, you have waterways, canals, and to get around, you can either walk or take a boat. In Venice, there are public vaporetti. Those are the water buses which stop every so often to pick up passengers. And then there are lots of smaller water taxis, private boats, and of course the beautiful gondolas which tourists love to take. I feel very sad about Venice because it's a city that is, how can I put it, it's losing its heart. Yeah, so what I dislike about Venice is this, because so many people have moved away, more and more of the real shops have closed down. By real shops, I mean bakers and other essential food shops. And it's true, every time I go back there, another one has gone. You know, it's really bad. If you walk through any part of Venice, nearly every shop you come across will be selling souvenirs, most of them rather tacky. I hate that. Well, of course, all year massive numbers of tourists visit Venice, and I think it's a terrible problem because the city just becomes like Disneyland. Yeah, it's true. To put it another way, it's not a living city any longer. I know tourists bring money to the city, but they're killing it too in a way. It goes without saying that tourists come to Venice for the history, the buildings, the art. Venice looks so fantastic. Obviously, there are no high-rise buildings, and that makes the city unusual, but the canals make it unique. Most of the buildings in Venice are sinking. Right now, there's a lot of construction work going on to strengthen their foundations. There's terrible subsidence, and the whole of Venice is sinking. It's really a big problem.
Thank you.
9.2, Exercise 2.
One of the most important archaeological projects ever undertaken has to be that of the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, because it threw a great deal of light onto the previously dark past and expanded our knowledge in so many areas, from urban planning to the beginnings of writing. These excavations were a joint expedition between the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, and were led by Leonard Woolley throughout, from 1922 until 1934. From the extensive work of Woolley and his team, it was possible to establish that Ur was the very first city in the world, founded at least 5,500 years ago. Because Ur was strategically located close to the Euphrates River, there's no question that its first settlers would have been self-sufficient.
Indeed, it was their development of irrigation and the domestication of animals that allowed a traditionally nomadic people to settle in one place with their livestock, knowing that they could depend on a regular source of food. However, away from the riverbanks, the environment was fairly arid, and as developed, it was no longer possible to grow enough to feed all its citizens. The soil simply wasn't fertile enough to support the level of production that the population required. For this reason, the people turned to trade. The inhabitants of became highly skilled artisans and traded their goods for food and other resources. The most flourishing period of as a city was between 5,000 and 4,400 years ago, when it was an important cultural, religious and commercial centre. It was around 5,000 years ago that mankind's first writing system developed, stemming initially from the need to record the city's stocks of grain accurately. Was not the largest city in the region at this time. While 4,700 years ago had a population of 34,000 people, the trading centre of Uruk, situated near the confluence of the Euphrates River and Iturungal Canal, had over 80,000 people and extended over an area of 1,000 acres. Like any trading centre, Uruk had a diverse population and was often referred to as the Rainbow City for this reason. It was actually two cities. There was the newer trading centre, Kulab, on the bank of the Euphrates, and Eana, the religious centre which fronted the Iturungal Canal. From about 4,400 years ago, Ur's power diminished, but it rose again around 4,100 years ago. This started the period known as the Third Dynasty, when Ur-Nammu, the brother of King Utuk-Hagal, established his kingship in Ur and its surroundings. Hardly had the Third Dynasty begun when it was brought to an abrupt end by invaders, who destroyed the city-state and relegated Ur to being a backwater again.
Test Folder 5. You will hear part of a lecture about the development of suburbs in the USA. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Today we're looking at how the suburbs of cities in the USA have developed since the middle of the 20th century. But first, a little history. Suburbs have existed in various forms since antiquity, when cities typically were walled and the villages outside them were inferior in size and status. However, the modern American notion of the quiet, unspoiled outskirts as a retreat for the wealthy city dweller is in evidence as early as the 6th century BC in Babylon. Further early evidence comes from Cicero, writing in the 1st century BC, who refers to suburbani, large country estates just outside Rome. Throughout Europe, the distinction between the city and outlying districts tended to remain sharp through the Middle Ages and Renaissance. To accommodate a large influx of newcomers, city walls were expanded, or, as with London, towns adjacent to the overcrowded city were gradually annexed to it. Generally considered a less desirable location, the urban periphery was inhabited largely by the poor. In England, the rich who owned weekend villas outside London gradually transferred their main residences there, and the middle class soon followed. By the mid-19th century, there was a marked preference for suburban living. Migration from the central city to the suburbs was encouraged by a succession of technological advances in transportation. Horse-drawn stagecoaches, railways, and the electric streetcar or trolley all enabled urban dwellers to commute longer distances than had previously been practical. Now in Europe, unlike the United States, suburbs grew organically as a response to human needs, and each suburb there generally has a center and often has a quite distinct quality from other suburbs. Since the mid-20th century, however, North America has seen a distinctive pattern of growth called suburban sprawl, an almost endless spread of low-density housing without any distinct neighborhood centers. This is an artificial system, conceived by architects, engineers, and planners, and it's already showing itself to be unsustainable. Unlike the traditional neighborhood, sprawl is not healthy growth. It's essentially self-destructive. It consumes land at an alarming rate while producing insurmountable traffic problems. As the ring of suburbia grows around most North American cities, so the void at the center grows too. Business and people move to fresher locations on a new suburban edge, leaving behind deteriorating downtown neighborhoods, which can only be revitalized with enormous effort. Suburban sprawl came about as the direct result of a number of U.S. federal policies. The most significant were the housing and loan programs, which, from the 1940s, provided mortgages to encourage home purchase. These mortgages were directed at new single-family suburban construction, discouraging the renovation of existing housing stock and the construction of higher-density housing. Simultaneously, a major highway program, coupled with the neglect of mass transit, helped make automotive commuting affordable and convenient for the average citizen.
Before you hear the rest of the lecture, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 11. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 11.
Suburban sprawl actually tends to be very simple, consisting of just a few components which are normally kept strictly segregated from each other. One component is housing subdivisions, which are districts consisting only of residences. They're sometimes called villages, towns, or neighborhoods by their developers, which is misleading, since those terms denote places which are not exclusively residential and which provide a richness of experience that is not available in a housing tract. Subdivisions can be identified as such by their contrived names, which tend toward the romantic and often pay tribute to the natural or historic resource they have displaced, woodland, mills, or ponds maybe, that have been destroyed. Another element, schools, have evolved dramatically in the past 30 or 40 years. A comparison between the size of the car park and the size of the building is revealing. Most are schools to which no child will ever walk. Pedestrian access is usually non-existent, and the spread of homes often makes school buses impractical, so the designs of schools in the new suburbs assume massive automotive transportation. Other components, too, such as shopping areas and business parks, have their own separate locations. As a result, one of the most conspicuous components of sprawl consists of the endless roadways that are necessary to connect all these elements. Since each section of suburbia serves only one type of activity, and since daily life involves a wide variety of activities, the residents of suburbia spend an unprecedented amount of time and money moving from one place to the next. And as most of this motion takes place in singly occupied automobiles, even a sparsely populated area can generate the traffic of a much larger traditional town. Now I'm going to examine the role.
Unit 10. In Your Dreams. 10.2. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 4.
Right, first of all, let's do a quick practical activity together. As you know, metaphor and symbols are important in the interpretation of dreams. Both Jung and Freud referred to symbolization in their analysis. Now, there's not necessarily one right answer. These pictures are meant to act as a springboard for your own interpretations. So I'd like you to take turns to talk about a picture and suggest what each might represent in a dream. OK?
Fine. Shall I start?
Go for it, Carla.
Right, with this one, I know Jung saw the sea as representing the unconscious. So perhaps something living in water like this exists in the unconscious. As it can move, it could be an insight or a new idea.
Well done. OK, Jason.
I had a dream a bit like this one. I was following behind a group, trying to keep up. I remember feeling rather anxious about that. I guess it could represent today's competitive world, or moving forward along life's path. Growing older, maybe. What's really interesting is that my dream had the same burnt colours as this. Well, enough about me. Helen, your turn.
OK. This one is classic Jung, isn't it? A larger-than-life character who might be seen as threatening because of his size. It might be some kind of problem that you have to deal with, a big one that you're really concerned about.
He couldn't be seen as friendly, could he?
Protective? Maybe. No, I don't think so. Are you going to do one too?
All right. Well, here we have another classic symbol, don't we? The image has actually been used in the dream sequences of films by Bergman and Pasolini, two great directors. In both films, there were no hands, maybe suggesting that time had run out. So this one must be all about limits, pressure of deadlines, appointments, that sort of thing.
Questions 5 to 7.
OK, can you get out your notes about the case studies now? Helen, can you start? Summarise the dream and give us your interpretation. And please challenge each other's views. Raise your own ideas.
Right, this dream is about climbing. A small group of people is trying to reach the top of a mountain. They're nearly at the summit, but the dreamer gets separated from the others when the mist comes down. He stumbles around for a bit and then goes back down to the bottom where the sun comes out, and he finds himself in the middle of a field of enormous white flowers.
Happy ending then?
Not so sure. As I see it, getting split up from the rest of the party could be seen as exclusion, but it's his own decision to retrace his steps, isn't it? Then he's surrounded by the flowers, which could mean that there's pressure on him to conform, but I think he rejects that.
Yeah, but the flower is basically a thing of beauty, a positive symbol. I think he's back in a comfort zone.
OK. Thanks, Helen. Carla, let's hear yours next.
Well, it's the face in the mirror dream. A woman looks into a mirror and sees a different face staring back at her. She's youthful and confident, but it's not a younger version of herself, it's another person. She starts rubbing at the glass and the face is still there, laughing now. This is a crisis of identity. The dreamer may have experienced some problems recently, or could be full of regrets about her own life. The face in the mirror is young and happy. This could represent envy of others, perhaps.
And you all agree with that?
Well, mightn't it be something to do with a dual life? You know, presenting a different, more outgoing face to the outside world?
Good. OK, Jason, let's hear you now.
I'm afraid I haven't done it.
Typical.
10.2. Exercise 7. Example.
Concede.
1,
Concession.
2,
Deduce.
3,
Deduction.
4,
Perceive.
5,
Perception.
6,
Consume.
7,
Consumption.
8,
Repeat.
9.
Repetitive.
Unit 11. The physical world. 11.1. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 5.
Today, I'm going to talk about two natural features of the English coast, Spurn Head and Chesil Beach. First, an explanation. A long, narrow accumulation of sand and/or stones, with one end joining the mainland, is called a spit, and Spurn Head is a good example of one. Spits are often created in sheltered areas where the waves aren't usually strong enough to wash the sand away, or where erosion further along the coast provides plenty of material. If you look at the sketch map, you'll see how a spit is typically formed. In this example, the prevailing winds blow from the southwest, creating a current flowing along the shore, known as longshore drift. In this case, it's moving roughly eastwards. The current carries sand or other material along the coast. At the turn in the coastline, the headland, larger stones are piled up on the seabed in the sheltered water immediately to the east of it. This forms the beginning of the spit. As more and more stones and sand accumulate, the feature is extended eastwards. The wind tends to pick up sand from the beach as it dries out and carry it to the sheltered side of the spit to form dunes. These are stabilised as grasses begin to take root. Gentle, low-energy waves entering the sheltered area behind the spit deposit fine mud, creating an increasingly shallow area of salt marsh. This is regularly flooded by the tide, and large amounts of vegetation grow there. The marsh slowly fills the area of shallow sea that is now largely surrounded by the spit and the original coastline, which in this diagram lies to the north of the new spit. Spits often form close to where a river widens into an estuary as it approaches the sea. However, the spit won't extend across the estuary if the river is too deep, or if the current of the river is strong enough to wash away any material deposited by longshore drift.
Questions 6 to 10.
Now I'll go on to Spurn Head, which is a spit on the east coast of England. It's about 5 kilometres long, with the North Sea to the east and the River Humber to the west and south, where the Humber reaches the sea. Spurn Head consists of sand that has come from the soft land to the northwest. The sea removes about 6 million tons of material from the cliffs each year, making them retreat 1 to 2 metres. This rapid erosion provides plenty of material for the spit. Longshore drift transports it southwards to Spurn Head and deposits it there. Records of the last 1,000 years show that the spit goes through a cycle of creation and destruction roughly every 250 years. What happens is that as well as bringing material from further north, the sea moves sand along the peninsula towards the tip. This narrows the neck, and in time, the sea breaches it. The tip is now isolated and is washed away, and then a new spit begins to take shape. The present spit is nearing the end of the cycle, and its narrowest point, which is only 50 metres wide, is in continual danger of being breached.
Questions 11 to 15.
Now, let's look at another example of a spit. A striking feature of the south coast of England is Chesil Beach, which is almost 30 kilometres long and never more than 200 metres wide. It links the Isle of Portland to the mainland. The beach probably began to develop 10 or 12,000 years ago, but the way it formed is uncertain. It consists of stones that are graduated in size. At the Portland end, they're as large as a large potato, while those at the opposite end are much finer, no bigger than a pea. The beach has created a shallow lagoon for much of its length, where it protects the River Fleet against the sea. The lagoon is rich in marine wildlife and birds. The Isle of Portland itself is made of limestone, and footprints of dinosaurs have been found in it. A great many London buildings, including St Paul's Cathedral, are made of Portland stone. Stone has been quarried for hundreds of years, but it was first mined in 2002 in the west of the island, not far from Chesil Beach. In places, the stone is above a softer material, which the sea is eroding. This has led to the formation of some collapsed caves along the southeast coast of the island, close to the southern tip. A harbour has been constructed by enclosing the bay between the mainland and the Isle of Portland, with Chesil Beach forming its western boundary.
Test folder 6. You will hear a hotel owner describing some interesting walks to a guest in the hotel. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 7. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 7.
Is this your first visit to the area?
Yes. I'm planning to do a lot of walking while I'm here. Are there any walks you'd recommend?
Oh, it's very nice for walking around here. If you turn right out of the door of the guest house and follow the road, it'll take you to the lighthouse. You can't miss it. It's close to the road, right on the headland. There's a footpath near it, just before the road turns left. You should go along the path to the edge of the cliffs, down the steps and turn left. So you're going back along the beach towards the headland and, if you're lucky, you might find some fossils at the bottom of the cliffs.
Do many people find them?
Well, not so many these days, to be honest, but you never know.
I read that there are some caves in the cliffs as well.
That's right, but you'll have to go south along the beach for those. They're at the nearest part of the cliffs to where we are, just where the land starts curving round. But they get cut off by the tide, so be very careful.
Yes, I will be.
Another nice walk is on the north side of the estuary. If you turn left from here and go along the road as far as the crossroads, instead of continuing along the road, take the footpath that runs parallel with it. That'll take you across the river. Then you can turn right onto another path. The stream is very shallow and there are stepping stones across it, so you'll be able to cross without much trouble. Then you'll come to the salt marsh. Keep to the riverbank, or you might have difficulty walking. Beyond that, there are sand dunes and a beach, and the islands just offshore.
Is it possible to row to the islands?
Yes, there's a place to hire boats in the village. Visitors aren't allowed to land on the island that's furthest from the shore, so as not to disturb the birds, but you can go to the others. In fact, they get plenty of birds too. The southernmost island is covered with wild flowers at this time of year. And there are the remains of an ancient fortress on the island that's right in the estuary.
OK. Well, thanks very much. I'll go out for a couple of hours now.
Enjoy yourself, and I'll see you later.
Unit 12. Nature or Nurture. 12.2. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 7.
The more we discover about the behaviour of birds, the more impressive it seems. But do they learn what to do, or is it somehow in their genes? Here in the studio is animal behaviour specialist Jenny Johnson to tell us. Jenny.
Thank you. Much of what birds know is innate or instinctive, programmed into their genes. They're born knowing how to identify food, and remember that what one species eats may be poisonous to another, so it's important to get it right. In the spring, when the days grow longer, the increased light alters hormone levels in birds' blood, triggering several essential changes in behaviour. For one thing, the alteration makes them migrate at the right time, so that they reach their nesting sites at the right time for the next stage in their life cycle. They're also programmed to build nests, with different species producing very different styles of nests. So these are things that birds are programmed to do at certain times.
And what about the sounds that different species of birds make? Are they also innate?
Yes and no. Some species are genetically programmed to produce particular sounds and don't need to learn them. Every dove coos, even if it doesn't hear other doves doing it. The same is true of nearly all birds' hunger and danger signals, which are among the 20 or so simple calls that are used to communicate certain messages.
Does this apply to birdsong too?
Birdsong seems to be a combination of genetic programming and learning. Some species are born with the ability to learn to sing, but not with the song itself, so it's different from cooing. Normally a chick, that's a young bird, hears the songs of lots of species while it's growing up, but the chick always picks out and learns the correct song for its own species. That's what it's been programmed to do. But if a bird is reared in isolation so that it doesn't hear other birds of any species, the song it sings will be a rudimentary version of the normal song. The programming isn't enough for it to sing the song in full. And interestingly, if a chick is brought up among birds of a different species, it learns their song, even if it can hear its own species singing around it.
Questions 8 to 12.
Do we know anything about the learning process?
Well, one bird that's been studied a great deal is the zebra finch, a small, colourful bird that originates in Australia and has black and white stripes on its tail, like a zebra. Just as we have to hear language when we're babies in order to learn to speak, zebra finches need to hear song early in life to be able to produce it. To become fluent in their song, they also need to practice it repeatedly. And in fact, one study found evidence that they practice in their sleep. Electrical brain activity goes on, which is similar to the brain activity when they're awake and singing.
That sounds like an efficient use of their time. Is there any time limit on when a bird can learn to sing?
Normally, a male zebra finch develops a version of the adult song when it's at least 20 days old and will have more or less learned the song by the age of 35 days. Practicing it means that it masters the song by around 60 days, and if it hasn't heard any zebra finches singing by then, it won't learn the song at all. After the age of 90 days, when the bird is fully mature, its song won't change.
And do all individual birds of the same species sing exactly the same song?
No, they don't. For some species, small differences can develop which over generations become different dialects, just as with human languages. This is often the case with birds that imitate others. Marsh warblers, for instance, spend the winter in Africa and can mimic the calls of over 70 bird species. These will be other birds living in the same region, so each male warbler's song indicates which part of Africa he winters in. A few species, like starlings and miners, imitate sounds that aren't birdsong and incorporate them into their own individual songs. Some starlings have been known to mimic sheep. In Oxford, they mimic buses. But the Australian lyrebird seems to be the bird world's best mimic. It can imitate 12 other birds, car engines, car alarms, even chainsaws cutting down trees.
Jenny, thank you.
Thank you.
12.2. Exercise 4. Example.
To have heard.
1,
To have occurred.
2,
To have finished.
3,
To have been doing.
4,
To be warning.
5,
To be caused.
6.
To have been studied.
Progress Test 3. This test is in the teacher's book. you will hear two students discussing a project they're going to write. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Hi, Ben. Glad you could come round.
Hello, Sharon.
Have a seat.
All right.
Now, we need to plan our project on the history of this town. I thought we could start by making a list of what needs to be done and divide the jobs between us.
OK. Well, the first thing is to decide what exactly we're trying to do. Shall we do that together?
Well, we could, but we've already talked about it and got a rough idea. Why don't you draw up a detailed description and then I can have a look at it?
OK, I'll do that.
Right. Then we'll need to find out what's already known about the town. I'd quite like to use the internet for research.
OK, though I know some good websites on local history. Maybe we could divide it between us.
Fine, that'll save time. Then there are some local documents in the public library. What do you think?
Well, a friend of mine is a librarian there, and I'm sure he'd help. So it'll probably be easier if I do it.
Good. I was hoping you'd say that. Then the other type of research we talked about was interviewing elderly people who've lived here all their lives.
Yes, the oral history aspect of the project. Do you reckon we should structure the interviews or not?
Maybe we should plan a few questions to start off, then just follow up what people say. Shall I think of some questions?
OK. Better wait till we've done the library and internet research.
Yes, you're probably right. And of course we need to find people willing to be interviewed.
Right. I'm not really sure how to go about it.
I was thinking about contacting local organisations for elderly people, like retirement homes and day centres, explaining what we're doing and asking if they know anyone who's lived here for 60 years or more.
There must be a lot of organisations to contact. Shall I take on half of them?
All right. I'll make a list and mark which ones we should each contact, OK?
Fine. We'll need to have copies of old maps of the town, won't we? I could look for those if you like.
Why not go to the records office? They're bound to have some there. And I can also look while I'm doing research.
Sounds good.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
Now, we need to know what buildings were here 70 or 80 years ago, don't we?
Yes. So many old buildings were knocked down in the 1950s and 60s to make room for new ones. It's such a shame.
Now, there was a 19th century school somewhere, wasn't there?
If you cross the river, turn left into South Street and continue along the road until just after it curves round, the school was on the left.
Oh, I know where you mean. Then there's the old prison. You know where that was, don't you?
No.
One of the windows still exists, with bars across it, as part of a shop. It's on the bend in the high street where it meets the market square.
OK. Well, then there's the George, an old coaching inn where coaches used to stop in the days before railways existed.
Where was that?
The entrance was in South Street, and the building occupied the corner of the high street.
And someone mentioned some warehouses that I'd never heard of.
Warehouses?
Yes, they were quite close to the high street on the opposite side from South Street. They were used by merchants transporting goods by boat, so they're close to the river.
Well, I never knew that. Right, the next thing we need to...
Unit 13. Cosmic debris. 13.2. Exercise 2.
OK, everyone, let's start. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the European Space Agency mission Rosetta, more popularly known as the Comet Chaser. The aim of the mission is to orbit and eventually land on a small comet in our solar system. This is something that clearly has never been done before. Actually, the ESA had a bit of bad luck. Rosetta was originally going to be launched in 2003, but the mission had to be postponed due to a malfunction of the launch rocket. This in turn meant that the ESA had to find another comet, because the one they first chose, called 46P Wirtanen, will have travelled far beyond Rosetta's flight path by now. Rosetta was launched on the 2nd of March 2004 and will be tracking a comet known as Churyumov-Gerasimenko. Let's call it CG for short during this lecture. Under the revised flight plan, Rosetta will make 1 flyby of Mars and 3 of the Earth before heading for CG. This circuitous route will enable Rosetta to make 2 excursions into the main asteroid belt before its rendezvous with our fast-moving cosmic iceberg in August 2014. Rosetta will slow down and go into orbit around CG, and from an altitude of just a few kilometres, its cameras will be able to map the entire surface of the comet at high resolution. This mapping exercise will enable a safe landing site to be selected, and once this has been done, the Rosetta lander will separate from the orbiter and slowly descend to the icy surface. If everything goes according to plan, the lander will anchor itself to CG's crust and begin a detailed survey of its surroundings. Over a period of several weeks, data from the 9 instruments on the lander will be sent back to Earth via the Rosetta orbiter. The lander will dispatch close-up pictures of the comet's nucleus, drill into the dark organic crust, and sample the primordial ices and gases. Meanwhile, the orbiter will have been transmitting radio signals through the nucleus to the lander in order to analyse the internal structure of the comet. The orbiter will monitor the changes that take place in the comet as it hurtles on its way towards our Sun. As the comet is increasingly warmed, bright jets will appear, creating distinctive tails as gas and dust are ejected into space. In fact, CG is probably a much better choice of comet than the original one, in that it typically becomes much more active than Wirtanen does as it approaches the Sun. Scientists certainly won't get bored studying this comet. The enormous amount of data that will be returned during Rosetta's voyage is likely to change our understanding of comets fundamentally. In addition, it will provide new insights into such basic mysteries as the formation of our oceans and even the origins of life. Thirdly, it is expected that Rosetta will give scientists vital insights about how to respond should there ever be a comet on a collision course with our planet. OK, so that's the Rosetta mission, which will terminate in December 2015. Try to find out more about it over the next few weeks. Why not check out the official website,
13.2. Exercise 3.
Actually. Basically. Certainly. Eventually. Fundamentally. Hopefully. Increasingly. Initially. Originally. Typically.
13.2. Exercise 4. 1.
Actually, the ESA had a bit of bad luck.
2.
Scientists certainly won't get bored studying this comet.
3.
The aim of the mission is to orbit and eventually land on a small comet in our solar system.
4.
the enormous amount of data that will be returned during Rosetta's voyage is likely to change our understanding of comets fundamentally.
5.
As the comet is increasingly warmed, bright jets will appear.
6.
Rosetta was originally going to be launched in 2003.
7.
It typically becomes much more active than Wirtanen does as it approaches the Sun.
13.2. Exercise 5. 1.
I actually know one of the scientists working on the Rosetta mission.
2.
The launch was planned for 2003 originally.
3.
It eventually took place a year later.
4.
Typically, comets develop bright tails as they get nearer the Sun.
5.
Scientists will certainly be given a lot of data by the end of the mission.
Test folder 7. You will hear part of a lecture about meteorites and about some craters they have created on Earth. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
For thousands of years, people have been fascinated by streaks of light flashing across the night sky. These shooting stars are actually tiny grains of dust from space that burn up in Earth's atmosphere before reaching the ground. But hundreds of times a year, a rock called a meteorite survives the fiery trip from space and lands on Earth. The vast majority are pieces of asteroids, the small rocky bodies that orbit the Sun. One November morning in 1492, a young boy saw a large stone plummet from the sky and land near the town of Ensisheim in Alsace, France. This fall is the earliest one witnessed in the Western world, from which meteorite samples have been preserved. Immediately after it fell, people began chipping off pieces as souvenirs, and fragments of the Ensisheim meteorite can be found in museum collections all over the world. When the Krasnoyarsk meteorite was found in 1749, no one believed that rocks came from space. But a German physicist analysed this meteorite's unusual mixture of stone and iron and began to convince skeptics that meteorites did indeed originate far from Earth. Antarctica is an ideal place to find meteorites because the dark specimens are easy to see against the snow and ice. As the ice sheets move, they push older ice to the surface. Powerful winds remove the ice, exposing the meteorites buried underneath. The largest meteorite on display in any museum is a 34-ton piece of iron that's just part of a much larger meteorite called Cape York. This landed in Greenland thousands of years ago, before any people lived there. Cape York originally weighed around 200 tons before it broke apart in the atmosphere. In 1947, people in eastern Siberia saw a huge fireball that exploded as it streaked across the sky, bursting into tens of thousands of fragments that made cracking and roaring noises as they fell to Earth. These iron fragments crashed into thick woodland, tearing apart and uprooting many of the trees and creating thousands of craters. Although countless meteorites have crashed onto the planet, most of the craters that they left have been erased or hidden by natural forces. Only about 200 meteorite impact craters have been found, of various sizes. Vredefort crater in South Africa is a ring of mountains with a diameter of 300 kilometres, which seems to be a record. One of Earth's largest intact meteorite craters, Wolf Creek crater, was long known only to the local population of native Australians. Their legend describes a rainbow snake that emerged from the crater and formed a nearby watercourse as it slithered away. In 1947, oil company geologists spotted the stunning crater during an airplane survey of some of Australia's most remote desert. Now, let's consider what we can learn from meteorites. It seems to me